Hello, I'm Dr. Barlow, and I'm an instructor in physics here at Santa Fe College, and I want to talk to you today about making basic measurements in DC circuits. We've found in Physics 2 labs here that students are challenged by making these measurements correctly, so we thought we would create this video so they would have a chance in their free time to review this important topic. I'm going to talk only about three very important measurements today, and that is making measurements of voltage, current, and resistance in a simple DC circuit. And the DC circuit that we're going to consider today is very simple. We'll have a battery up here and three resistors in series in this circuit. I have four important points denoted in this circuit, points 1, 2, 3, and 4. Please take note of them. I'm going to refer to them later when I'm making measurements. It should be noted that this circuit and all of those that we use in the labs here are of low power and are not dangerous. So now I wanted to talk briefly about the equipment we're going to use and you're going to use to make these measurements. We have depicted here a digital multimeter, and as the name implies, it's capable of making a variety of measurements in DC and even AC circuits. For instance, it can measure current, resistance, voltage, and sometimes they can also measure capacitance. But it's important that you have the meter set up correctly for the measurement you're going to make, or you will not get correct results. So you'll see at the top there is a dial. The dial must be set for the quantity you want to measure. For instance, current would be over here, resistance here, and voltage down here. Then we must also select whether we want an AC or DC quantity many times, and then we must also select the range appropriately in the dial up here. Now down below you'll see the ports where we're able to insert the probes that we will use to interface with the circuit. We will always have one in the common port, but where we put the other probe depends upon the quantity that we are measuring. For instance, resistance or voltage, I would place the probe in the left port. For current, I would place it over here. And then be thoughtful about the range, and I would be able to make the measurement. Here's another meter we're going to use sometimes in the lab. I wanted to mention this is an analog current meter, and we also have to have it set up correctly to make the measurement. Notice there's a switch here. It allows you to select between AC or DC current. Usually AC is denoted by a squiggly line on these meters, so I have it there in the DC setting. Again, we'll have a probe always in the common or the black port, but where we put the other probe in this meter selects the range which we're going to measure. For instance, if I put the other probe here, it says that the meter will measure between 0 and 0.05 or 50 milliamps. Place the probe here. We'll have a range of 0 to 0.5 amps here, 0 to 5 amps. So we have to have this meter set up correctly as well to make the measurement. So I've mentioned probes, so let me just show you a little bit and talk a little bit about the kind of probe we're going to use in the meter today. Of course, it's just a wire, but the ends are of a particular type. This is the end that always interfaces with the meter. It's just a straight post, and we call this type of end a banana end. On the other end, I'm going to have an alligator clip-like thing here, and it will allow me to hook it to various points in the circuit, and it will stay affixed strongly, and it's a very good end to use. We refer to this probe as a banana alligator, and I'm going to use these today. So let's get on now to a discussion of the measurements that we're going to make. I'm going to first demonstrate making a measurement of DC voltage in a simple DC circuit. So we have to have the meter set up correctly, and then we have to use it appropriately in the circuit. We want to always place it in parallel with the element of which we want to measure voltage for. For instance, here I'm measuring the voltage drop across a resistor. I do not disassemble the circuit to measure voltage, and I must have power to the circuit. It's a simple measurement to make, so I'm going to go over here now and make this measurement at a couple of those positions in the circuit that I showed you earlier. So I'm going to select the correct quantity on the dial, DC voltage. I have the probes in the correct ports, and I will first measure the voltage from points 1 to 2 in the circuit that I had on the up earlier, and notice I get about 1 volt. I'll now measure the voltage from points 2 to 3. 1 volt again. I will measure the voltage from points 3 to 4. Again, 1 volt. And I'll conclude by measuring the voltage from points 1 to 4 in the circuit, and I get about 3 volts. Interestingly, that's the sum of the 3 previous voltages I measured, and also the voltage of the power source here, the 2 resistors. Notice I had the meter set in the correct position, and I placed the leads in parallel with the measurement I wanted to make. I did not disassemble the circuit, and I left power on to the circuit. So let's discuss briefly common mistakes that students make when measuring voltage in a DC circuit. They'll have the meter in AC rather than DC mode. They'll select perhaps an incorrect range on the meter. Sometimes there'll be a faulty fuse in these multimeters, and that will cause it to measure voltage incorrectly. The battery in the multimeter could be low. There's a small battery in these multimeters that give them power. It could be low and it will not measure voltage correctly. Meters in the wrong, probes in the wrong ports on the meter. This is often a mistake. Students will have the probes set up to measure current rather than voltage. They'll incorrectly place the probes in the wrong positions in the circuit, or they'll have a circuit with no power to it. It's a dead circuit. So next we'll talk about making measurements of current in DC circuits, and this is the measurement that students struggle with the most. To measure current, we have to place the measuring device in series with the circuit. In other words, we must open up the circuit and let the current run through the meter. So we still have power to the circuit, but there's a little more work than measuring voltage. We have to open up the circuit and let it run through the meter. So I will now go over and demonstrate with both of these meters how to make that measurement in this DC circuit. So I will first use the digital multimeter. I will select DC current in the correct range. I will move the red probe over to the port for measuring current, and I will, at point 1 in the circuit, I will open up the circuit and let it run through the meter. And the meter registers about 10 milliamps. I will do it now at another point in the circuit. Let's open up the circuit at point 2 and measure the current there. Again, I'm going to let it run through the meter. And again, we get 10 milliamps, and likewise, we would also get this at points 3 and 4 in the circuit, since current is common in a series circuit. I will now make the measurement with the analog meter. So I have the analog meter set up. It's in DC mode, and I have chosen the correct range, an appropriate range for this measurement. And I'm measuring the current through point 2. And we see the analog meter registering about 10 milliamps relative to the range I've chosen. So let's discuss common mistakes students will make when measuring current in a DC circuit. Often they'll select an incorrect range on the meter. We have some of the issues that might cause problems that we discussed previously. Usually they will have the probes in the wrong area of the circuit. They will not open up the circuit and let the current run through the meter. They also might have no power to the circuit or a dead power source in the circuit, which would also cause issues with measuring current. So finally, we would like to discuss today measuring resistance in a DC circuit, or measuring resistance of elements that might go into a DC circuit. So to measure resistance correctly, we have to have the meter set up right, but we must isolate the element from the circuit that it would go in to measure resistance correctly. So you see here, I'm measuring the resistance of one resistor, and I have the probes on either end. So I will now go over and I will demonstrate measurements of resistance with some of the elements that we have here. So I'm going to do this with the digital multimeter. I will put the probe in the resistance port, and I will choose resistance on the meter. And I'm going to measure the resistance for one of the resistors here. I must remove it from the circuit and place my meter on either side of the resistor, and I get about 100 ohms. Now suppose I wanted to measure all three of the resistors in series. A common mistake students will make is leaving the three resistors in series in the circuit and making the measurement. When I do that, I'm measuring the resistance of the resistors in series and everything else that's in parallel with them in the circuit. To make the measurement correctly, I would have to isolate the three resistors from the circuit, which I've done by removing those two leads, and only then can I make the correct measurement. And we see it's in the neighborhood of 300 ohms. So let's review some of the common mistakes that students will make when measuring resistance in a simple DC circuit. They'll have an incorrect range selected, many of the issues that we mentioned before. They'll have the probes in the wrong ports of the meters. They'll incorrectly place the probes across the item they're wanting to measure. But the most common mistake is they will leave the resistor that they're wanting to measure the resistance of in a circuit with other resistors and a power source, and you will not get the true resistance value for that resistor. You must isolate that element from the circuit. So let's review the things that we've covered today. Measuring voltage. We want to place the meter in parallel with the element that we're measuring the voltage of. Leave power on to the circuit. You do not need to disassemble the circuit. Measuring current. You must open up the circuit at the point where you want to measure current and let it run through the meter with power onto the circuit. Measuring resistance. You must isolate the resistor or group of resistors from the circuit with the power source to measure resistance correctly. So remember the facts I've given you today, practice the techniques I've shown, and you too will be able to make effective measurements in the DC Circuits lab.